Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a massive and honestly, highly controversial mega project proposed for India's Great Nicobar Island. We'll be walking through claims, data, and arguments from a recent, highly critical analysis that actually calls this project one of the largest environmental disasters in the nation's history. We're going to look at exactly what's being proposed, the strategic reasons behind it, and the fierce pushback from environmental and human rights experts. So, let's jump right in. We're actually starting our story today not with bulldozers or infrastructure, but with the leatherback sea turtle. As the source material points out, this is a species that has literally survived asteroid strikes and ice ages over the last 66 million years. And here's the crucial part, their absolute largest nesting ground in all of India is right here. It's at Malacca Bay on Great Nicobar Island. But the source warns that this proposed development threatens to permanently destroy over 90% of those nesting sites. To wrap our heads around this, we'll quickly cover the Great Nicobar ecosystem, the proposed megaproject itself, the ecological and social costs, the geopolitics of the Malacca Strait, and finally, the regulatory and corporate controversies. All right, part 1, the proposed megaproject. We're looking at infrastructure on a truly unprecedented scale for this region. The source analysis really centers on this jaw-dropping number, 81,000 crore rupees. That's the estimated financial cost to completely transform this island. And the government is aiming to have the very first phase of this immense development up and running by the year 2028. So, you might be wondering, what exactly does 81,000 crore buy? Well, the government plans 4 massive pillars: an international container transshipment terminal, a dual-use military and civilian airport, a huge power plant, and a sprawling commercial township. The ultimate goal here? To permanently settle somewhere between 3.5 to 6.5 lakh people on an island that, right now, is mostly untouched wilderness. Moving on to part 2. Ecological and social costs. What is the true cost here, moving beyond just the financial price tag? This perfectly illustrates a major discrepancy in the public narrative. The source points out a pretty stark contrast in how the data is presented. You see, the government often frames the deforestation as minimal, saying, hey, only 1.82% of the forest will be cut. But here is the catch. That percentage is based on the entire Andaman and Nicobar Island chain. Contextually, if you just look at Great Nicobar Island, this project actually equates to a devastating 15% loss of its specific green cover. And that discrepancy extends to the actual number of trees on the chopping blocks too. The official government estimate states that 7.11 lakh trees will be felled. However, independent researchers cited by the source estimate that up to 1 crore, 10 million century-old, untouched tropical trees could be destroyed. The source emphasizes that losing these massive natural air conditioners will drastically reduce local rainfall and likely trigger severe heat waves. But beyond the flora and fauna, the source heavily stresses the imminent threat to human life, specifically the Shompen tribe. According to the 2011 census, there are only 299 individuals left in this group. They're an uncontacted, particularly vulnerable tribal group who have lived in these forests for generations, totally isolated from the outside world. Because of that deep isolation, the Shompen entirely lack immunity to outside diseases. Experts cited in the source, and this includes 13 international genocide experts and Survival International, warned that a sudden influx of hundreds of thousands of outsiders will be fatal for the tribe. They've literally called this project a death sentence and equated it to genocide, drawing some pretty chilling parallels to the disease outbreaks that wiped out indigenous populations centuries ago. Let's go to part 3, geopolitics and the Malacca Strait. So, what's the core justification given for this massive disruption? Well, supporters of the project heavily push a narrative of national security. They claim the project will allow India to strategically choke China's trade at the Strait of Malacca. To understand this, let's just quickly define the geography. A strait is simply a narrow channel of water connecting 2 larger bodies of water. But the source argues this geopolitical justification is actually physically and geographically flawed. The actual narrowest choke point of the Malacca Strait is down near Singapore, where it's just 2.8 kilometers wide. Great Nicobar Island, on the other hand, is 200 to 300 kilometers away from the strait's entrance. So the source argues that claiming to choke the strait from Great Nicobar is a huge strategic overstatement, since the real control points are held by nations like Singapore and Malaysia. Furthermore, the analysis asserts that this so-called Malacca dilemma is a 20-year-old concept that China has already planned for. They've spent decades building alternative trade routes to bypass this exact constraint. Things like pipelines through Myanmar, the CPEC through Pakistan, overland routes in Central Asia, and even pushing for Arctic shipping. Because of all these alternatives, the proposed choke point strategy is practically ineffective today. Which brings us to part 4, regulatory and corporate controversies. If the strategic argument is disputed, how did this get approved? Let's trace the timeline of regulatory shifts because it's highly controversial. Back in 1997, Galathea Bay was a protected wildlife sanctuary. But by January 2021, that status was abruptly denotified. Even more shockingly, the source claims that official maps from 2020 clearly showed intact coral reefs, but a newly issued map in late 2021, it just completely erased them, allegedly to smooth the project's path. And returning to that regulatory timeline, critics highlight the Environmental Impact Assessment, or EIA. Usually, an EIA for a project of this massive scale takes months, if not years, of meticulous on-ground study. However, the source alleges this vital assessment was rushed through in a mere 6 to 7 days. They claim it cherry-picked data and conveniently left out findings that highlighted severe negative impacts on the environment. The source also heavily critiques the alleged bypass of tribal consent, pointing to direct violations of the Forest Rights Act. For example, the mandated local committee was supposed to have at least 2 tribal members on it, but it only had 1. Even worse, the Gram Sabha, the local village council that officially approved the diversion of this precious forest land, allegedly contained 0 indigenous tribal members. Now, here's where it gets really interesting regarding the actual land use. If this is strictly a project for national security and trade, the distribution is striking. Out of roughly 116 square kilometers of project area, the core port infrastructure only takes up about 1 square kilometer. The vast, overwhelming majority of the cleared land, almost 115 square kilometers, is designated for commercial townships. We're talking casinos, resorts, and entertainment clusters. So the source concludes its critique by suggesting the national security framing is really just a mask. When you look at the fact that 11 major companies have expressed interest in building this out, prominently featuring massive private developers like Adani Ports, critics argue this isn't about geopolitics at all. Instead, they say it's about the rapid privatization and corporate exploitation of ancient, pristine lands. And why does this matter to us? Because projects like this set a massive global precedent. They show how easily sweeping environmental and human protections can be bypassed for commercial gain. Ultimately, the source leaves us pondering a really heavy question. Based on the data we've walked through today, is the promised geopolitical leverage that many experts say is geographically flawed anyway, is it actually real? And even if it is it worth the guaranteed destruction of unique wildlife, the clearing of millions of ancient trees, and the very likely eradication of an uncontacted human tribe? Take a moment to think about what true national treasure really looks like. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.